Hi guys, welcome back to another snapshot video. The third experimental snapshot of the 1.18 version was released yesterday. There were a couple changes to the world generation. Again, we'll take a look at those later, but what most people around me talked about were some changes to mob spawning. So let's check that out first. So there were two major changes to the system. First, I want to talk about the one that was far less controversial. I think most people would agree on that it's a good change, and I also think this way. So it's basically the introduction of a individual mob cap for every player instead of just having a global mob cap. So with the old and the new system, the global mob cap is basically raised by 70 for each player. So if you have one player on, then at most 70 mobs would spawn around the player. If there's two players on in different areas, it would be 140, with three players 210, and so on. But this was always only a global mob cap, and now we have an individual one as well. We got a little info board here in the back that shows one possible scenario. So with the old system, if you had player one flying at the maximum world height high up in the sky, he was further away than 128 blocks from any block. That also means he had 0 hostile mobs around him and was contributing 0 mobs to the global mob cap. Then player 2 that was mining underground would have the complete mob cap filled around him. So he would have 140 mobs around him instead of the 70 that he would usually get if he plays alone. So he was just facing far more mobs because the other player didn't contribute anything to it. In the new version, so we would have player 1 flying at max world height, he has 0 mobs around him. Player 2 still facing the usual amount of 70 mobs per player. So the change is pretty good. This also means if player mob would be AFKing high up in the sky at his mob farm, that player 2 wouldn't take up the entire mob cap for himself, and the mob farm would actually work like in single player. So in case you're playing on a busy server, let's say Hermitcraft comes to mind, we usually always have somebody on the server playing, then you could run your mob cap like you would run it in single player. What player 2 does would not affect your mob farm. So that's actually a pretty good change, I'd say. Nobody's really arguing against this. In case you're wondering if the new system would affect mob switches, the answer is no. So there's still the global mob cap, even with the new system. So in this case, it would still be 140 mobs. So in case you have 500 shulkers loaded somewhere, they would by far exceed the mob cap. That means there would be no new hostile mobs spawning around any of the players. So the mob switch system would not be affected by this. Now let's take a look at the second part of the changes that is a bit more controversial. A lot of people take issue with those changes. So first I'll try to briefly explain the old system and how it worked. Right, so here we are on the end dimension, a couple hundred blocks away from the main end island, and we got a spawning platform at the lowest possible block at Y0. So if I would kill the Enderman here, wouldn't take long until they respawn back. So the mob spawning is just incredibly fast at the lowest layers, because it's basically the only block that could be selected by the spawning algorithm to spawn the mobs here. If I would actually add a platform 100 blocks above this one, so I'm just gonna add some glass blocks 100 blocks higher that no mobs could spawn on, then you will see that the mob spawning will be a lot slower, because the chance that the Enderman would actually spawn down here is 100 times lower. As you can see, the mob cap is still not filled up. It just takes forever until the right blocks are selected. So what the system did previously, until the latest snapshot, was that it tried to spawn mobs between the lowest and the highest block. So the highest block could also be this one. There could be gaps in between. So in case you had the highest block was at Y5, there's basically a 20% chance that this block here would actually be selected for mobs to spawn on. If you only had a single block, then there was a 100% chance that each spawn attempt would select this block to spawn mobs on. So in case you have additional blocks, 100 blocks above, then you only have a 1% chance that mobs would be selected to spawn on top of this block. So that's why it was beneficial to remove blocks for your mob farm and try to build it as slow as possible. But it only made sense if you removed every single block above your spawning platform. So let's see the difference again. If I get rid of the glass platform high above, bam, immediately we got a lot more mob spawning. I switched to the latest experimental snapshot version with the new mob spawning system. So let's have a direct comparison how the spawning platform in the end dimension would be affected and later explain how the new system works. Okay, let's get rid of the endermen. Let's see how long it will take until they spawn back. You can see right away, well, with the old system, it only took a fraction of a second until the mob cap was filled again. Now this is just significantly slower. Mob cap is still not filled, we still got endermen spawning. It's just way slower. And we also don't have any glass platform on top. And additionally, a glass platform on top would also not affect the spawning rates at all anymore. You can see it would still spawn at the same speed. Everything is just slower. So let's take a look at what the new system does. Instead of randomly spawning mobs between 0 and the highest block, it tries to spawn mobs per sub-chunk. So in the old system, we had spawn attempts that were made per chunk. So a chunk is basically a 16 by 16 region that goes up to the sky. And now the new system, the spawning attempts are made per sub-chunk. A sub-chunk is basically a 16 by 16 by 16 section of the chunk, which is indicated with the blue lines here. So here we basically got the first one, then here's the next 16 by 16 by 16, and so on. So in case of a 256 high world, you got 16 of those. Alright, so the new system tries to spawn a mob in the highest sub-chunk. If it succeeds or not, it goes to the next one and tries to spawn mobs again until the very bottom. Additionally, there's only a 24% chance that a mob spawning attempt succeeds. So this would also explain why the spawning at Y0 is so much slower. So it still tries to spread all the spawning attempts in a sub-chunk between 0 and 15. So between 16 blocks. So compared to the ideal scenario that we had before, where only a single block was possible to spawn mobs on. Basically had a 100% chance with the new system. We only have a 1 in 16% chance that a certain block would be selected. And additionally, there's only a 24% chance that the spawn attempt succeeds in the first place. So that's why a spawning platform at Y0 with the new system is roughly 64 times slower. On the other hand, if we have a spawning platform built up very high in the sky, the spawning speed is faster than with the old system. So the spawning speed is roughly the same as we saw with the spawning platform at Y0. But it's 4 times faster than with the old system. So with the old system, we had a 1 in 256 chance that exactly this block would be selected. And now it's still roughly 1 in 64 chance for a successful spawning attempt. For comparison's sake, I switched back to the old version, and we can indeed see that mob spawning is just significantly slower. We only got a single pack of endermen spawning by now. It'll probably take half a minute until the mob cap is filled. Now, of course, there's the question how the new mob spawning system would affect normal gameplay. And I'm afraid the answer is not at all. So if we take a look at a normal world here, the number of hostile mobs you would encounter around you is mostly affected by the mob cap. So as you can remember, there can only be 70 mobs around a player. And usually it doesn't take long until the game has spawned in those 70 mobs. Usually it takes less than a second. If I quickly kill all the hostile mobs around me, a second later they already spawned in back. So this is basically the same with the old and the new system. The number of mobs you encounter is basically the same. Even in the new mountain biomes, the changes to the mob spawning system won't be even noticeable or significant because the mob spawning was already quick enough there. So the problem might have been that the spawning attempts are spread between -64 and in this case 185. So roughly a 1 in 250 chance that a certain block was selected by the mob spawning algorithm. So we can directly compare this. So I'm in the latest snapshot with the new system. Can clear the mob cap real quick and do it again after a second. As you can see, we got 64 entities again. So it takes roughly 1 second for new mobs to spawn in. Let's compare that with the version from last week. The game didn't really like me opening the same world in the old version, so that's why I went to a similar area, a high mountain, so we can compare directly. I'm gonna kill all the mobs, and 1 second later, we got 120 entities again. So it's basically the same. The spawning algorithm is fast enough to supply the player with enough mobs, so it's really not noticeable. But why was this change made in the first place? According to the patch notes, this change is intended to make spawning more consistent in the updated overworld. But as I've just demonstrated, the changes aren't noticeable at all. Furthermore, I have the suspicion the new spawning algorithm might not be as optimized as the old one. So with the old system, we only try to spawn packs of mobs per chunk, and the new algorithm tries to spawn packs of mobs for every sub-chunk. I think more calculations need to be made for that. So the performance might even be worse for that, but I'm not really an expert to judge on that. Mulching developer King Bedox offered a bit more of explanation with his Twitter post. So he said those changes attempt to solve a few problems: long-term design upkeep, mobs spawned less at surface than in 1.17, and mob farms that can't be moved like witch farms were nerfed compared to 1.17. Okay, I'm gonna pick out point 2 first. Mobs spawned less at surface than in 1.17. The reason for this is quite simple. We just have bigger caves now, and the chance for mobs to spawn underground is just a lot higher. So if you have a big cave like this one here, it just has a lot more potential spawning spaces. So if you're standing at the surface, the game tries to spawn in mobs until the mob cap is filled, which usually takes like a second. And if the available spawning spaces underground, are just higher than the ones above ground, that means more mobs will be underground. That's the reason why there are fewer mobs at the surface. So the changes to the current system wouldn't really deal with the problem, only partially, because the game tries to spawn in mobs the highest sub-chunk first and then goes down. If the mob cap will be filled, by the first spawning attempts, then it stops the spawning attempts. So after a while, the first couple mobs would start to despawn, and the game tries to fill up the available mob cap again from top to bottom. So there might indeed be a slightly higher chance that mobs would be at the surface, but I don't think it would really compensate the much higher spawn rates in the caves. I think another approach to solve the issue with insufficient mob spawning at surface level would have been a more direct one. You could, for example, use the height map. So if the potential spawning space is the highest block, that only has air blocks above, then mobs have a 100% chance to spawn. If it's a block with other blocks above, which can easily check with the height map, then we only have a 25% chance for the mobs to spawn. So this way, the chance for mobs to spawn at the surface would just be a lot higher. Next point, mob farms that can't be moved like glitch farms were nerfed compared to 1.17. That was indeed the case. They were about half as fast as in 1.17. The reason is, the game tried to spawn mobs between the lowest block, so the newer version, minus 64, and the highest block. So in case of the witch farm, a 1 in 128 chance approximately. And with the new system, it would be like in the old version, roughly 1 in 64. So the witch farms would be, with the new system, be just as fast as in 1.17. I feel like it would have been better to change the witch farms individually than to change the whole system for them. Could have, for example, increased the bounding box of the witch farm by 100%, and then the farms would have also been just as fast as in the old version. That only leaves us to talk about point 1. The long-term design upkeep. I think this is probably intended for the case that if Mojang ever intends to expand the world height again, maybe 5 years, maybe even go lower with the mining or go higher and even add higher mountains, maybe in 20 years even add a realistic Himalaya region to the game that is 10,000 blocks high, then the old mob spawning system would indeed not work properly, but the new one kinda would. So I guess they want to prepare for that case already. Next, let's talk about why a lot of people don't really like this change to the mob spawning, because it affects the whole meta of building mob farms. So first of all, the changes hardly affect any changes to farms that are built high up in the sky and don't require a perimeter. So they are slightly buffed. You need to make them a bit smaller now. You don't need as many spawning spaces as before, as long as they were built above Y64 or above ocean level. So in case of this one here, you could make it slightly smaller and still get the same rates. It was, by the way, also already possible to build up epic farms high up in the sky that don't require a perimeter. Here's, for example, a mob farm we built about 6 years ago during 1.8, before we actually knew how the mob spawning exactly works. Simpler times back then, but we even achieved over 100,000 drops per hour with a farm that was built at sky limit. So you could already build epic farms, high up in the sky back then. So what I'm trying to say is nobody ever was forced to make a perimeter to build an efficient mob farm. We're also seeing this right now in the Cycroft Blitz server. We don't really see a need to make a perimeter to get enough item. It's just something extra we could do. But with the new system, it wouldn't be necessary at all anymore to make an epic perimeter like this one here in order to get better spawning rates. This is the one we made in the Peaceful series, removed every block down to bedrock and build the mob farm as low as possible to benefit from the better spawning rates. With the new system, the mob farm down here in the perimeter would be just as fast as one as you build up high in the sky. There wouldn't be any difference. There's no need at all anymore to make a perimeter, which was a really nice endgame goal and offered a lot of content for a lot of players. So players made systems to efficiently remove blocks, etc. This wouldn't really be necessary in a lot of cases anymore. So the new mob spawning algorithm is basically just another case where the game gets easier and easier for no real reason, and interesting endgame goals are removed without replacement, at least in the current form. So the game gets easier and easier, and what I mean there is that if you build your mob farm high up in the sky, you can now make it maybe 20 to 30% smaller, so you need to spend a little bit less effort to get the same rates. But the really interesting part, making a perimeter, stuff like that, which is extra, nobody ever needed it, but in case you want to spend the time, you could do it. That's basically almost completely removed. One exception would maybe be a slime farm. You need to build the farm low, because that's where the slimes spawn. So that would be one of the only scenarios right now where perimeter definitely would help you increase the rate significantly, but you could also run a normal slime farm and still get enough slime for pretty much every project already. So to sum it up, the additional of an individual mob cap is definitely a good addition to the game. The other change to the mob spawning hardly has any effect on normal players, but for players that are really interested in mob farming, they are mostly considered detrimental to the enjoyment of the game. Let's also go over the other changes in this snapshot that were mostly affecting the world generation. So according to the patch notes, the biome placement was tweaked in order to prevent situations where a desert would generate right next to a snowy slopes biome, but I still found some examples where this happens. In patch notes, it was also mentioned that it still can happen, so it is a bit unfortunate. So sometimes you got a desert and there's other biomes sprinkled in between that would allow snow layer generation. So there's, for example, a forest biome. Since it's high enough, there's some snow generating here. It's actually a snowy slopes. It's on the border. Okay, so you can still have desert right next to snowy slopes. Also in between. That's a bit unfortunate. But I think at the end, stuff like this will also be fixed. The next thing to talk about is red sand. It generates more frequently in the Badlands biome now. And as you can see here, we even have some proper red sand deserts, so they can get quite large. There are a couple changes that are kind of hard to show. So according to patch notes, the stone shore biome, so here we got an example, is less likely to generate. And then on the other hand, beaches were tweaked to make them more inclined. It's also a possibility that pillager outposts generate in mountain snow. And villages can generate in the meadow biome. I think it's the same type of village that would generate in the plains biome, so the same type of architecture. Here we actually got an example of a plains village that has the same type of houses. We also have a new biome. Here is the Stony Peaks biome. I think this is supposed to top of a mountain around warm biomes. So here we got a desert and Badlands biome, and then the Stony Peaks on top. This is basically the same as the Snowy Peaks, just without the snow. Alright, that's all for today. Thanks guys for watching and see you next time. Bye bye!